If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what urban legends, cryptids, etc., do you believe in or have seen? Well, I believe in Purple Aki, but he definitely exists. This 6 feet 5 inches black guy roams Liverpool in the UK and asks to touch young men's muscles. I'd say he reached urban legend status maybe 10 years ago, before the documentaries and the Facebook Purple Aki spotted pages started springing up. Maybe he's more of a local celebrity now, but for a few years there, he was like a mythological figure. In 2016, police began investigating an allegation against the BBC of incitement to racial hatred after Rake complained that the 2016 documentary, The Man Who Squeezes Muscles, Searching for Purple Aki, was racist. In the film, he is referred to as a big black man 3 times, and it is said that everyone has seen him or been chased by him, and everyone thinks they have spotted him and felt a shiver. One alleged victim says, "He is just purple and huge." One of the stories of the Jersey Devil. Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, this part is historical fact, was living in New Jersey for a time. He was a fan of hunting, so he went out one winter day to hunt bears. The bears in NJ are a different sort than in France, so he was excited. This part begins the legend. He got separated from his bodyguards while he was following hoof prints. They looked like they were running because they were close together, ankle to ankle, but long in stride. He figured it was a deer running from something, possibly a bear. His suspicions were confirmed by claw marks high on a tree. The prints passed, but there were no bear paw prints in the snow, and it was fresh snow, so there should have been. Anyway, he tracks the deer for a while, and it goes under logs too low for a deer, skips terrain, and all that, and seems to slow. He finds no spoil but broken branches, disturbed leaves, and broken ice high up and in passes too narrow for a deer's antlers. So he's thinking this is some odd New Jersey creature. Well, he was right. Because abruptly the track stopped in a copse of pine. Couldn't be found anywhere. He's creeped out and decides it's time to turn back, so he turns around and is confronted by a tall, 2-legged satyr type of beast with bat's wings, deer legs, a man's body but leathery, and a donkey head, and its arms had claws for hands. The story is that it screeched, and he unloaded both barrels at it and was found pissed at himself by his bodyguards. Did he really see JD or just say it to avoid embarrassment? I prefer the first option myself. My uncle told me this when I was a child, and it kept me awake many nights. He said he was driving home for work after dark, spotted a young girl walking on the side of the road, stopped, and picked her up because it was very cold outside and she was only in pajamas. He gave her his coat to keep her warm and drove her home. She got out of his car and ran into the house. He went home. He realized she still had his coat when he got home, so he figured he'd just stop at the house on his way to work the next day and retrieve it. He got there and knocked on the door. Mom answered the door but informed him her daughter died on that road several years ago, and if he gave her anything, it could be retrieved at her grave site, as this was a fairly regular occurrence. He got directions and found his coat on her tombstone. Thanks, Uncle Tim, for scaring the snot out of me when I was just a kid. I never believed in werewolves or anything like that until one night when some friends and I were cruising around the back roads of our town, which is located in a hilly area along the Mississippi River. There wasn't a whole lot to do where we lived, so driving around was a common pastime of ours. I was sitting in the back/trunk area of my friend's Jeep looking out the back window when I noticed something along the side of the road. It looked like a muscular shaggy dog, but it stood at least 3 to 4 feet tall on all fours, had muscular looking legs that almost resembled human biceps, and I could see the reflection of its eyes staring at the vehicle as we drove past. Where it gets weird is that when I mentioned it to my group of friends, we all became stricken with horror when we realized 3 of us had seen the same thing along the same road on different nights but never brought it up because coyotes were common in the area. I still don't know what to think, but what I saw was too large to be a coyote and too shaggy to have been a cougar. To this day, I wonder if some unknown creature lives in those hills. I am from Bosnia, and here we have a so-called monster who makes very creepy and disturbing noises such as a baby crying and some demonic roaring. We call it Drekovic, which means something like screamer. It usually appears in the woods near a town called Drvar, where the inhabitants have reported hearing the monster's cries during the night, mostly when it dawns. Others also report it, usually deep in the woods. The people who encountered it claim that it is a very small goblin-like monster with claws, a big head, pointy ears, and sharp teeth. Those who have encountered it claim they had to carry the monster until morning as it jumps on the back of the poor guy and refuses to get off until morning. This was more famous in the early 2010s and sometime during 2008, but the sightings are ultra rare now. The Fae. I grew up in rural Ireland and saw a few things that even now I can't explain. I saw a light moving quickly across a field, probably about 10 to 15 feet off the ground. Disappeared into the trees. Too low to be an aeroplane or a helicopter, too high to be a tractor, too late as well. People are like, shit, you saw a UFO. Which, please, that mother ducker was a will-o-wisp or something. Then there are the fairy rings. It feels like someone is standing right beside you when you walk near one. It's the creepiest damn feeling I've ever had. I was camping one night in my backyard, 1.25 acres of land, with my buddy. I was only about 7 to 8 at the time. Buddy wakes me up and says he heard some singing. I'm thinking it's just my mom singing along to music, but I can't hear anything. We open up the tent and look outside. There are no lights on at the house. Then we hear it again, like this otherworldly, bittersweet voice. It was like silk but also raspy. Like there were two voices rolled into one. It was then that we saw her or him. Absolutely gorgeous. The hair was like gold spun into individual, infinitely thin strands. The skin was like cream. Eyes like the most intensely bright emerald. Her face is carved into my memory. She, or it, was so beautiful yet terrifying that Buddy wanted to go and meet her and follow her. I couldn't do it. I was frozen to the spot. It was almost like every cell in my body knew that nothing good would come of it. I managed to hold Buddy back, but then she walked into the trees at the edge of our land and disappeared. I used to hear the singing every now and again as I grew up. It terrified and captivated me every time I heard it. About 3 years ago, me, my sister, and a cousin were driving back home from the movie theater when we encountered a really strange occurrence. I can't explain the feeling I get, but when I think about it, I get tears in my eyes and feel that fear that spread all through my body when it happened all over again. Basically, I was in the back seat, and my sister was driving. We were on a back road in a very rural county, in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, and we were about 5 minutes from my house. The stretch of road we were on was completely straight and surrounded by thick woods. It was pitch black, so you could only see about 100 feet in front of the car. So we were driving, and all of a sudden, about 100 or so feet ahead of us and over a little hill in the road, we saw a large white thing walking across the road in an upright position. In a really weird fashion, it hit us all as absolutely terrifying. With no thought at all, we all started screaming. We drove up on it, and it was no longer standing up. In fact, it was a large white dog. And it just sat down. Right in the middle of the road. I don't know what kind of dog does that. We were all terrified, so my sister drove off the road around it. We kept driving, talking about how scary and off-putting that was, when the craziest thing happened. This is what really scares me to this day. About half a mile up the road, the exact same dog comes walking back into the road. And no kidding, he sat down in front of our car. You can only imagine how terrifying that was. To this day, it scares me to death just to think about it. I have another story of an odd creature I saw back in that county, but I'll save it for another day. Needless to say, I don't live there anymore. My mother grew up in a little town in Northwest Virginia. There was always this old car on the side of the highway. It was difficult to see from the road, but still visible. At some point, somebody thought it prudent to investigate after several years of this car rotting away. Inside the car, they found 2 decaying corpses. Apparently, a young couple had a single car accident and wound up dead in their car off the side of the road, and nobody bothered to check because people leave cars in the woods all the time for no reason. The big thing about the corpses was that the woman still had hair, even though the rest of her was in pretty bad shape. Over the years, the hair melded with the vinyl seats, so when they removed the corpse, the head tore clean off. Somebody starts the legend that they lost the head and it was still rolling around the mountains of West Virginia looking for victims. My mother hears it, and it terrified her as a kid. So, of course, she tells 9-year-old me and points out the spot where the car was the next time we're there. It gave me nightmares for a while. The Wendigo. Basically, because my college was located inside a national forest and a lot of my good friends were outdoor leadership majors, we spent many nights out in the woods, had some terrifying experiences ourselves, and had some stories that were really similar to some of the stuff described in this series. At one point, the op describes a person who didn't have a face, who appeared almost out of nowhere, and who could move incredibly fast. I flipped because I graduated college in spring 2014. During my last semester, my mom was extremely sick with a terminal illness. I didn't know it was terminal at the time, and I had to travel home almost every weekend to help with various things. I went to college in rural North Georgia, and my hometown was Savannah in coastal South Georgia, so every Friday afternoon or evening I'd run the same route through the sparsely inhabited center of rural Georgia to get home. It was about a 5.5-hour trip one way, and I hated doing it alone. So one weekend, one of my best friends came down with me. We were driving along a long, straight stretch of backwoods highway, just one lane in each direction, and hadn't seen any other cars for at least a half hour. We were about 20 miles past one small town and at least 20 miles from the next small town. There were no streetlights, and the stretch was entirely forested, with no houses, roads, or small private driveways to turn off on. All of a sudden, literally out of nowhere, I saw a man who I could have sworn wasn't there before. He was so close to the car that I thought I was going to hit him. I clearly saw that he was standing on the center line, or maybe a foot into my lane. My friend and I both screamed, and I slammed my brakes, swerved to avoid him, and stopped. That's when we both realized he was actually on the side of the road, about 10 feet away, nowhere near the center line. He was facing us casually, as if we were the point of interest. We stared at him for a few seconds before I snapped back into normal driver mode. We drove off. We continued on our way, but both of us were super uneasy, and we couldn't exactly pinpoint why for a solid minute or two. Then we both realized that aside from his inexplicable jump from the center line to the side of the road and his appearance literally 20 miles from the nearest town, we both clearly pictured him in our memories as not having a face. And it wasn't that we hadn't looked, either. We both knew he'd been wearing jeans and a reddish hoodie with the hood up. He had brown hair that was long enough that we could see some locks framing the hoodie. But his face was literally exactly as described in the referenced op story, a blank canvas. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. I never drove on that stretch of highway again. Instead, I opted for longer routes that took me through towns. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty badly. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was a lot younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, or whatever. Since it was late summer or early fall, it wasn't even approaching dark yet. His car was an old, beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small-town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar, baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. This guy looked like he was out of the 40s and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being so hot out. But maybe that was the only clothing he had. So the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. The teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. The teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tried talking to the guy, just trying to make a simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down, like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy just tips up his hat, looks out the window, and says, "Stop the car now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend a possibly crazy man. The guy stands on the side of the road for a second, and then, at a dead sprint, just runs off into the field beside the road until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. Granted, the crop was fairly tall. He waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the flu or something and didn't want to spit next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about really old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back on the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merge. But there wasn't a car in sight. What there was the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running, crawling, after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher is beginning to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time, his eyes were glued to the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to speed and lost sight of the guy in his mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a pay phone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her, and he had been talking to her coworker about the hitchhiker. When he asks why she would think that, apparently at her office in the town she worked in, one of her coworkers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them. And it is a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with the new girl at work, who had to drive home alone at night. So yeah, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. French-Canadian legend. I grew up in a small town next to the city of Lille. Lille was one of the first French settlements in Canada back in the day, like 380 years ago. Here it goes. During colonial times, on Christmas Eve, a big party was organized. Everybody in town was invited to the biggest house in Lille to celebrate Christmas. It was a small community, so everybody knew everyone, but a man that no one knew about came to the party. He was well dressed, had good manners, and spoke very good French. He was getting along with everyone, especially the women. The man started dancing with the most beautiful woman present at the party, and when he was about to kiss her, all the babies present started to cry, like crying with madness and fury. The man was so taken by surprise that he burst through the wall of the house, making a gigantic hole in the wall, and disappeared. Context: in French Canadian folklore, we believe that when babies start crying together at one man, he is supposed to be Satan. And know the final plot twist part. Today in Lille, you can see an almost 350-year-old house with a gigantic hole in one of its walls. The house is owned by no one, not even the city, and will probably stay there until it fades away. Some people say that the house is still up because it was touched by the devil. I live in Louisiana, and my dad told me about grunches, and it freaked me out for a little while. We had lived in Ohio basically my whole life in a suburb, and when we moved back to my parents' home state, it was ripe for making spooky stories with all the woods and history to exacerbate the creeping feelings. Grunts are basically demons, experiments, or monsters that center around a road no longer in use called Grunch Road that was used by people to get to New Orleans. Named after a prolific family that had a mansion or plantation along the road, rumors abound about them that they were devil worshippers or had demon blood in their lineage. They were accused of things like human sacrifice of their slaves and animal abuse. Basically, a grunch is normally described as a man-goat with razor-like teeth that can freely switch between looking like a goat and a bipedal monstrosity that will trick and eat travelers who are on the road. When people talk about grumpy roads, they say if a goat is blocking your car by just standing there in the middle of the road, do not get out. Just wait it out or go around. Not so much an urban legend, but there's a true vampire story from very near where I live called the Vampire of Croglan Grange. Gazing out of the window in admiration, Amelia's eyes suddenly caught glimpses of two flickering lights that were moving in and out in the dark shade of the tree belt. Amelia's gaze got fixed on the lights as she saw them emerging out of the tree line. The lights, as she saw them, were fixed on a dark object. She kept watching in dismay and horror, just to notice that as the lights drew closer, the object on which they were fixed kept growing bigger and bigger. She was frozen by an inexplicable horror. Somehow she managed to jump out of bed and run towards the door. While attempting to unlock the closed doors, she heard a scratching sound on the window. She turned around to see, and to her horror, she noticed a hideous creature with a terribly ugly face and glaring eyes scratching on the window with its bony fingers. Suddenly the scratching sound stopped, and a pecking sound replaced it. Amelia knew immediately that the creature was attempting to pick up the lead. Within moments, the glass pane of the window fell off. Not exactly comforting in the darkness of the countryside. A hunter is out in the woods and, after a long, unsuccessful day, realizes night is quickly approaching. Knowing it would be impossible to make it home before dark, he wanders until he finds a cabin in the woods. He sets his gun on the porch and knocks on the door. The latch is broken, and the door creaks open. He calls in to see if the cabin is occupied, but no one answers. The hunter steps in and looks around. He reaches for a light but finds there is no power. The cabin is one room, and the hunter feels his way around and finds a bed in the corner. He strips off his clothes and collapses in bed. From the bed, the hunter looks around and notices several portraits on the walls. He doesn't recognize any of the faces, although he notices musingly that all the portraits seem to be staring at him. He falls into a deep, comfortable sleep. Morning arrives. The hunter looks around the cabin during daylight for the first time. He realizes there are no portraits. Only windows. I was told this was a true story about a town in Wisconsin. This town has mostly corn fields and is flat, sort of a drive-by town. There are some pretty deep woods off the highway that shelter a church. The church actually dates from the late 1800s and has been long abandoned. At some point, teenagers and some creepy old man took to performing satanic rituals at the church. They made attempts to call them creatures from hell or interdimensional demons. After this goes on for some time, they find everyone dead at the church after they've been missing for a couple days. Completely shredded and mutilated at the site. The general consensus is that they succeeded in their efforts but were unable to control what they had called. Now this jumps to a first-hand account from a social studies teacher I had in junior high. She claimed that this was well known in the town. That when you drive through the town area around this church, you do not stop your car. Whatever was called is still there, hunting at night. So the social studies teacher's friend is driving through this area to visit a friend in the next town. He's blasting through this road, surrounded by cornfields, and minding his own business. Suddenly there's a terrible shrieking and ripping sound at the passenger side of the car, and the car thumps hard. Thinking that something just blew, he carefully slows down and gets out to take stock. The scene is as such: the moon is out and it's quiet in the middle of the country. The corn stands quietly in the dark with the headlights blazing in front of the car, illuminating the green of the fields. The engine was ticking from the heat. No wind, but some small noise from the field as the corn plants touch each other. Walking around to the side closest to the field, he observes that the passenger side has what appears to be claw marks that puncture the metal running from behind the front door all the way to the back bumper. The bumper is metal, and it's been pulled back like something was hanging from it. Spooked and now knowing the car is still operable, the guy runs back and gets in, taking off quickly. Not long after, the man arrives at his friend's house. He brings his friend over to the car immediately and conveys the story to the friend. The man, hearing all this, turns sheet white. He then informs his friend of the story above about the church. He tells him that this happens to people from time to time. When people get out of their cars, they usually disappear. When I was a kid living in Texas, I had a recurring dream. In this dream, I was walking down the street of my hometown, and a man would walk towards me. Sometimes he was older, and sometimes he was younger. He didn't always have the same face, but I always knew it was the same man. He would get closer and closer, and I would know that something bad was going to happen, but I would wake up each time before he reached me. I would be terrified. One night, in my dream, we finally got face to face and I spoke to him. I said, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Sammy." And then I woke up, and I was so afraid that I couldn't go back to sleep. I went to my sister's room and said, "Can I get in bed with you? I've just had a really bad dream." My sister said, "Was it Sammy?" I said, "What did you say? How do you know Sammy?" And my sister said, "I don't. But you just brought him into the room with you." I turned on the lights, and I saw that my sister was asleep. I'm not sure if this story has been told before because I'm not sure how well known it is. I heard it from a friend who heard it from an acquaintance they met while on vacation. The acquaintance was from Japan, which is where the story happened. A young girl, let's call her Hope, had always been happy and carefree. She was energetic and enjoyed dancing and singing. But one day, Hope changed. She took on a comatose state. She didn't talk, she didn't move, she just lay in her bed all day, every day. Sick with worry, her parents took her to the hospital. After running dozens of tests, the hospital workers could find nothing wrong with the young girl. She was perfectly healthy, yet she still remained in a coma-like state. Eventually, the girl's health began to deteriorate. She lay in the hospital for months, losing weight and getting progressively worse. And yet, there was nothing clinically wrong with her. The hospital members had nothing to offer the parents except kind words. After months of this, one nurse came to the mother and told her that Hope may not be with them much longer and that perhaps the mother would like to take her out for one last day in the park. Hope had loved the park. Her mother agreed, and she took Hope in a wheelchair to the nearby park. She was pushing her under the dense, beautiful trees when something miraculous happened. Hope suddenly jumped up from her wheelchair and began to dance around. She twirled as flowers fell from the trees around her. She jumped and ran. Her mother watched in silence, tears of happiness dripping down her cheeks. Her mother snapped picture after picture of her beautiful daughter, who she thought had made a miraculous recovery. However, after a few minutes, Hope returned to her wheelchair in her comatose state. Her mother hastily returned her to the hospital and explained what had happened. The workers didn't have an explanation for it. That night, Hope passed away in her sleep. Her mother was hysterical. She couldn't understand what had happened or why her daughter seemed to be better in those moments. A few weeks later, she developed the pictures she had taken of Hope. What she saw filled her with terror. There was Hope, but she was not alone. And she was not dancing. Behind her stood a demon, grinning maliciously as it held Hope up by her hair. The demon was swinging Hope's comatose body around. Hope had been possessed the whole time. I will tell you the story of the doll in the attic. There is a small town in rural Minnesota. If you know where to look, you will find a house with an attic window. The doll will be staring down at you. Most people don't see it these days since the highways were rerouted a few years ago to go around the town instead of through it. But the doll's still there, just like it has been for decades. Nobody knows why it's there, unmoving. Some say that a little girl was locked in the attic for days until she died of thirst, and the doll is a memorial. Some say that a little girl disappeared from the park across the street, and the doll stands in the window to watch over the children who play there to this day. Some say there was a little boy in the house who was mentally disabled or disturbed, and when the people of the town made his life hell, he hanged himself in the attic window for all to see, and the doll is a reminder to the townsfolk. There is a man who lives in the house, but he will not speak about the doll. They say he's left a time capsule in the town with the secret of the doll, but it won't be opened for another 200 years, long after you, and I have turned to dust. On the day the capsule is opened, I think the doll will still be standing in the window. The Devil's Tramping Grounds. The Devil's Tramping Ground is a mysterious, perfectly round, and absolutely barren circle about 40 feet in diameter in the pine woods of Chatham County. Not a tree, not a flower, not a lowly weed, or even a single blade of grass will grow within the limits of the circle. Seeds sown there refuse to sprout. Any vegetation transplanted there will wither and die. And, what's even stranger, any object left in the circle at dusk will have been violently moved outside its bounds by dawn. Dogs tuck their tails between their legs and whimper when brought near, and they will dig their heels into the sand, refusing to be brought into the circle. Men have tried to spend the night in the circle, but not one has succeeded and remained sane. Something they see on their vigils drives them out of their wits, never to recover. The Devil's Tramping Ground has earned its name. It's said that here the devil himself walks at night. In his tramping ground, the devil spends his nights pacing around and around in a circle and turning his bitter mind towards ways to bring human souls to damnation. The scorching heat of his cloven hoof prints is what kills the vegetation and renders the soil barren. He angrily brushes aside anything left in his path, his great strength easily able to toss aside the heaviest objects. And, because when he walks in his private spot on earth, the devil drops the illusions with which he disguises himself when he appears to men, in his natural state the face of this fallen angel is so horrible that no man can see it and remain sane. The mystery of the Devil's Tramping Ground has been known since Chatham County was founded shortly before the War for Independence. From generation to generation, the story has been passed down, and despite efforts by scientists to explain this barren patch of land, no satisfying explanation has ever been given. So if you're driving on State Road 1100 in rural Chatham County at night and you pass a curve in the road where there's a narrow path leading off into the woods, if you see a shadowy figure moving between the trees, it's best to drive away as fast as you can and never look back until you're long gone. The Moon-Eyed People. The Moon-Eyed People are a race of small men who, according to Cherokee legend, live underground and only emerge at night. Unlike the Cherokee, the Moon-Eyed People are bearded and have pale, white skin. The Cherokee knew the Moon-Eyed People primarily from the many remains they left behind, the mounds and low stone walls that can be found throughout the southern Appalachians. Of these monuments, perhaps the most famous is just over the North Carolina border in Georgia, at Fort Mountain. Apart from their small stature and exclusively nocturnal lifestyle, the Moon-Eyed People, unlike the other Cherokee phantom races such as the Nunahi or the Yunwit-Sooty, seem essentially human. Coupled with the fact that they are pale-skinned and bearded, this has led to a significant amount of speculation that the legend of the Moon-Eyed People represents a Cherokee folk memory of contact with a group of European settlers who made it to the New World before Columbus. That's where the Cherokee legend of the Moon-Eyed People has been matched up with the Welsh legend of Prince Madoc. I was driving down a back road in West Virginia in the middle of the night when I came around a curve and saw an injured dog standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes and missed him by a hair. I got out to find him because he was limping really bad, and I was hoping he'd have a collar. He vanished into thin air. 6 months later, I was going down the YouTube rabbit hole and watched a video about the most haunted places in West Virginia, and they talked about this road that is haunted by the ghost of a limping dog that lures people into the night. Ducking Road. They said the route name, and I almost threw my laptop across the room. I'm not superstitious. But now? I'm a little stitious. The Black Lady of Bradley Woods is pretty cool and creepy. During the Wars of the Roses, or alternatively, the Barons' Wars, a young woodsman and his wife lived with their baby son in a cottage in Bradley Woods. Eventually the woodsman left his family to fight in the Earl of Yarborough's army, leaving his wife to bring up the baby alone. After many months, there was no news of the woodsman. Every day she would take her child and walk to the edge of the woods, awaiting the sight of her husband coming home from the wars, until one day the enemy army crossed the Humber and marched through the area on the way to attack Lincoln. As she was leaving her cottage, the woman was set upon by 3 hobblers, who brutally spoiled her before snatching the baby boy and riding off laughing into the woods. Heartbroken and humiliated, she wandered the woods, searching in vain for her child and husband. After her death, people began to see her wandering the woods, carrying on her never-ending search. It is rumored that if someone ventures into the woods on Christmas Eve and shouts the words Black Lady, I've stolen your baby 3 times, the lady appears to them to take back her child. Obviously Bloody Mary too. After seeing that episode of Supernatural, I remember how much she terrified me, and I didn't look in my mirror for a week. I looked awful. We have two where I live. The first is on a road called Pine Run Road. Basically, you can see shadows moving across the road. I've seen them myself, and it basically looked like a shadow of a person in a walking motion that moves from one side of the woods on the side of the road to the other. When I saw it and the lights from my car hit it, it was like watching someone disappear into the tree itself, not around it, just straight in. Gave me goosebumps. The second story is about a ghost woman known to us as the Suskin Screamer, based on a back mountain road called Suskin Road. I admit I do not have the balls to do it, but the story is something like this. A woman was murdered here on her wedding day, and you can see her. The thing is, though, in order to see her, you have to stop your car in the middle of the night or early morning, turn your car off, take your keys, and put them on the roof of your car. When you look into your rearview mirror, you'll see her sitting in the backseat. There's a road by my high school where a brother and sister crashed in the 1970s. They hit a tree, the passenger's side was against the tree, and the car caught fire. She died when the driver's side door melted shut, and the brother's arms, I've met him, the family is prominent in the community, are horribly burned from trying to pry his sister out. People had to pull him away from the car, he almost died trying to get her out. My old science teacher, who retired as of 2009 and was young at the time, lives across from the site and was the one to call the police. He told us he still dreams about her screams. Anyway, since then, there have been several crashes on that road, which is a straight, non-winding road, two of them into the same tree that the original car veered into. The odd thing is that most of the accidents that have happened there have resulted in deaths. I've heard between 10 and 15 over the years. This is a tiny town, and this is within the same mile. That much is true. I've known of 6 accidents and 4 deaths, though 2 were in one car, in my lifetime. I've been living there since 1996. They were all within a mile of the tree, which is marred from all the accidents. The urban legend is that sometimes if you drive past the tree at 12:13 a.m., the reported crash time, you'll see something in the distance down the road. It looks like a single approaching headlight, but if you go towards it, there won't be a car. It's the burning girl, trying to get back to her brother. An extension of this is that you can feel your arms burning when you see her. I have friends who swear they've seen the burning girl but not the arms part. There used to be an old bridge out in the woods, known to the locals as Willy Bridge. It had no guardrails, was eroded, and was barely wide enough for one car. I'm talking about maybe 2 feet of clearance on either side of your car. Rumor has it that back in the 1950s, there was a young woman driving across it with her young child and baby. The baby started making a fuss, and the young woman turned in her seat to see what the problem was. In the process, she accidentally drove off the bridge, and all 3 of them drowned. Another variation on the story is that it was a young couple and their newborn. The wife was asleep, and the newborn was crying, so the husband turned to take care of it and accidentally drove them off the edge, drowning them all. It is said that late at night, you can see the young woman in her white dress twirling in the woods nearby. Others have seen a ghost car crossing the bridge. The Willy rite of passage is to drive out onto the middle of the bridge, turn off your car, and wait. Your windows will fog up, and you'll see baby handprints. Some claim to have heard the woman crying out for her baby as well. Having grown up here, I've been to Willy many times late at night, and I can say with certainty that it's creepy as duck, haunted or not. It's completely isolated, and you access it via dirt roads. Unfortunately, it's also super hazardous for cars, so it was torn down recently to make room for a modern bridge. In my hometown, there was an old black woman who would cover her face with white powder or makeup, so she was this ghostly white. Her name was the Pancake Lady or White Face, depending on where in town you lived. She's been around for as long as people can remember. People remember seeing her back when they were in high school in the 1980s, with her being as old as she is now. There are multiple stories about why she paints her face, the most common being that when she was young, her husband left her for a white woman. And she just snapped. She painted her face white because she wanted to be white. She always wore these clothes that made her look like she was from the 1950s. She rarely left her home, only coming out at night to get groceries. And it was terrifying when you'd see her. She never spoke, she just stared. She had cinder blocks on her porch to trip kids who would try to knock on her door, not that she needed them. No one messed with her or bothered her. Rumor has it she once broke into someone's house and just left a dead squirrel in the freezer. Earlier this year, though, she passed away. The newspaper had a big article on her because no one really knew who she was. She had no family that they could find except for a distant cousin in a neighboring city. Sometimes, when you drive down Kirkwood, you can see a light on in that house, and when you look away, you might catch that white face staring through the windows. I grew up in a small, 256, rural town in north-central Arkansas. Nothing but woods and mountains for miles and miles. Not even a single traffic light. The town wasn't even on maps back then, but with Google Maps, you can find it. My grandfather and his friends were avid hunters, and they did a lot of hunting at night. Fox hunting and coon hunting anyway. They used to tell stories about a creature called red eyes. And that pretty much summed it up. It was a pair of red eyes that would appear when you were out in the woods at night. Now all animals have eyes that glow when you shine a flashlight at them, but supposedly if you saw red eyes, you could turn off your light and the eyes would continue to glow. If you walked towards it, it would walk away from you, keeping the same distance and never turning its back. If you shot at it, you would never hit it, and it wouldn't run away. That's about it. Pretty lame urban legend. But the guys who swore they had seen it were old country men, who didn't drink, and weren't prone to making stuff up. The freaky part is, when I got older, we used to drive out into the woods to drink and smoke pot, and every now and then we would see a set of red eyes while driving through the woods, and we would always kill our headlights to see if it was red eyes. It never was. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, give or take 5 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed, and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning. So the evil will forget our faces." Navajo to English equivalent. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time. I listened to my uncle sing an old prayer until we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces. Just eyes. Like the brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." Navajo English equivalent. Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter. Just a pause. Because it wasn't alone. The scariest urban legend I ever came across is one I stumbled upon in my own small village in Ohio. Our little community was known for its strange happenings, and this particular phenomenon still haunts me to this day. It all started 7 years ago on a warm summer evening when I sat with my friend on the village green, sharing tales of our town's history. R, now a family man and 20 years older than me, was always honest and sincere. As we exchanged stories, R grew quiet and shared an eerie experience from his 20s. Back then, he and some friends, young and foolish, decided to break into a dilapidated dorm building about 100 feet away from where we sat. They explored the creepy place, filled with graffiti, porn, and junk, until they grew tired of their spooky antics. Making their way to the building's back door, they found themselves in a small courtyard. R was the last one out, and as he emerged, 2 large black dogs charged at them from the woods beyond the village green. His friends screamed and scrambled back inside, frightened. Amid the panic, R noticed the dogs sitting calmly beside a very tall man standing about 20 feet away from them. R was enraged and yelled at the man for letting his vicious dogs threaten them. But the man, wearing an old trench coat and a hat that hid most of his face, spoke with a gruff voice, saying, "You should not be out here after dark." This statement sent a wave of fear through R, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Despite his fear, R shouted back at the man, demanding that he leave. Then, in an instant, the man and his dogs vanished into the darkness, leaving R and his friends terrified and confused. The memory of this encounter still disturbed R deeply, evident in the way his hands shook as he held his beer and kept looking over his shoulder. What scared me even more was that I had heard about the man in the trench coat and his dogs 2 years before R told me his story, from a friend named John in our town. John, another honest and genuine person, shared his encounter with what he described as a guardian angel in the forest surrounding our village. He and a friend had attempted to steal from the Forest Preserve's donation box one fall night, but his friend got stuck between the walls. While panicking, John saw the same tall man with the 2 black dogs, who eerily questioned why his friend couldn't get out if he could get in. Miraculously, John's friend managed to free himself, and the man and his dogs disappeared just as quickly as they had appeared. John, who is not religious, considered this figure to be his guardian angel, a way to cope with the terror he experienced that night. Intrigued by these similar accounts, I decided to investigate further by creating posters with a crude drawing of the man and his dogs, asking if anyone had seen him. Eventually, more stories emerged, including one from a professional cyclist named Mike. He had encountered the man in the early 1990s while walking his bike up a deserted, wooded road. The man warned him not to be out there without enough lights, and when Mike turned on his headlamp to confront him, the man and his dogs disappeared without a trace. Bringing these witnesses together, they found solace in sharing their terrifying experiences as their accounts aligned with one another. However, I soon received a warning from a local chief, a friend of the Shawnee people, urging me to stop seeking out the man with the 2 black dogs. Realizing the danger I had put myself in, I agreed with the chief's advice, understanding that when you peer into the darkness may peer back. A local bar used to be a popular hangout for the locals, but it has since been torn down. In the early 80s, on a swinging Friday night, this guy in a long black trench coat walked in. He was white and really handsome. But he definitely stood out because, after all, this was a reservation bar full of natives. The main thing that stood out to everyone that night was that he was very good looking, and all the girls were oohing and awing over him. He started dancing on the dance floor with everyone and having a good time. Then a girl who was nearby looked down, and the guy had hooves for feet. She screamed and yelled about it, and he ran out the back door of the bar. A bunch of guys chased him, and he ran around the corner of the building towards the front, and he just disappeared. This is the legend of our neighboring country, Wales, in the UK. Pretty sad, but believable. Enjoy. According to legend, the stone monument in the field marks the resting place of Gellert, the faithful hound of the medieval Welsh Prince Llewellyn the Great. The story, as written on the tombstone, reads: in the 13th century, Llewellyn, Prince of North Wales, had a palace at Gellert. One day he went hunting without Gellert, the faithful hound, who was unaccountably absent. On Llewellyn's return, the truant, stained and smeared with blood, joyfully sprang to meet his master. The prince, alarmed, hastened to find his son and saw the infant's cot empty, the bedclothes and floor covered with blood. The frantic father plunged his sword into the hound's side, thinking it had killed his heir. The dog's dying yell was answered by a child's cry. Llewellyn searched and discovered his boy unharmed, but nearby lay the body of a mighty wolf that Gellert had slain. The prince, filled with remorse, is said never to have smiled again. He buried Gellert here. Near where I live in Oregon, there is a vortex, which is a tourist attraction. Legend has it that this particular land was feared by local tribes of natives, and it was forbidden to visit it. Horses would not walk through it. People of all sorts report an eerie, unexplained feeling in this area. If you visit, there are even things called bent light anomalies, which have occurred when people take pictures around the area. Take that article with a grain of salt, but the photos show what I'm referring to. Light seemingly bends in a photo, and floating white lights can appear in photos taken no matter the lighting. They have dozens and dozens of these photos from throughout the years. Nearby, in this vortex area, is a graveyard called Rocky Point Cemetery. People also report lots of activity in this area, and people often see a white cloaked figure carrying a light through the graveyard, which vanishes if you get too close or if it knows you can see it. People report green misty fog rolling through the area and even seeing flames spring from various graves and crypts at random, yet no signs of burning are ever found. There is a young girl people see along the side of the road in broad daylight catching butterflies, and if you see her, she turns to you, but as soon as she makes eye contact with you, she vanishes. People have gotten into car accidents due to not paying attention to the road after seeing her vanish. People have had windows on their cars spontaneously break when traveling through the area. And not just windscreens, but side windows, mirrors, and the like. People have also seen the headlights of a truck shining from places no truck could access, like the sides of sharp hillsides and other insane locations. No car is ever heard or found, only the headlights briefly shine on them, unmoving. The sheer number of sightings of these things is crazy. I am, in most cases, skeptical of things like this, but I've personally been there at night and seen the floating lights and flames in the graveyard. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8 p.m., and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor was far away. Something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out about it. My mom said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared. Until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature, tall, probably 8 or 9 feet tall, white, humanoid with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth at me like a praying mantis. My sister and I ran screaming back to the house, where my mom stood, jaws dropping. She saw it too. I had never been so scared in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved. Back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying, so we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point, a very loud bang and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid that I would wake up to find my animals missing. The next morning, my grandma asked if we had heard the loud bang outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it haunts me to this day. I used to be terrified of Slender Man for a while, but I realized it was just because I was high and alone at night, walking back home. It didn't help that everywhere on campus people had put up Slender Man posters because it was Halloween. Ben Drowned caused some sleepless nights for me when I was keeping up with the lore, but I quickly outgrew it when I realized how it was being accomplished. But the one thing that continues to scare me that I do not fuss with is the Rake. I live in the Northeast, so it's particularly terrifying. One of my friends said he saw one at the edge of his bed once, but I'm sure it was his mind playing tricks. But I try not to learn about it because I just don't want that to happen to me. All of the images and lore surrounding it chill me to the bone. I also used to live in Lawrence, Kansas, near Stull, Kansas, and had a particularly spooky experience there. For those that don't know, Stull is one of the 7 gateways to hell, where a witch who had given birth to a spawn of Satan was hung. They try to restrict access to the graveyard there, but there's a normal graveyard that's accessible. I specifically remember one night walking up there with my friends and talking about the lore and spooky stuff that has happened to other people. We opened the gate without closing it and started walking up the hill on which the graveyard was situated. We got to the top, and one of my friends stated, "That's where they hung her," and we heard a terrible wind blow from behind us, rustling the branches and creating an eerie cacophony from the trees. Needless to say, we bolted to the entrance, which was now closed. We vaulted over the fence and ran to our car for a quick getaway. I have not been back since. My friends have supposedly had far worse experiences there, and I was happy mine was relatively vanilla. The Rake. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he had gotten out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly that his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the darkness for a half second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man or a large, hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it but more concerned about its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5, it just seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway, leading to the kids' rooms. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, the news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature on its first 3 pages but never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the second week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brought me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me.